Hello and welcome back to Press Review, bringing you top stories from international papers and analysis on stories in the Middle East. Starting with the UK's Guardian, which leads its front page reporting on story on the NSA leaks, stating that Britain's three senior spy chiefs came into the public glare for the first time to claim that leaks by the former NSA analyst Edward Snowden were being lapped up by the country's adversaries, but also to concede that the disclosures have prompted discussion with the government over how to be more transparent about their methods. It features an interview with jockey Tony McCoy along with a picture of the jockey kissing his son Archie at Towcester racecourse after making history by winning his 4,000th race. It also features an article written by Ian Black, who claims that Saudi Arabia is preparing to spend millions of dollars to arm and train thousands of Syrian fighters in a new national rebel force to help defeat President Bashar al-Assad. The Independent dedicates its front page with a report on maternity care crisis. The report claims that the health service spends 1/5 of its budget on insurance against negligence claims. It also features a picture of Twitter big hitters Dick Costolo CEO Jack Dorsey, Mike Gupta and Biz Stone seen trading in Twitter shares start at the New York Stock Exchange. With today's centre photo of the Duchess of Cambridge, the Daily Telegraph headlines, "Security leaks help Al-Qaeda change tactics." The writers depict that terrorists around the world are already changing their methods because of the disclosures by the Guardian newspaper, MPs were told. Al-Qaeda and other fanatics were lapping up the exposing of UK spying techniques, which had put operations at risk and caused damage that would last for years. The leaders said the GCHQ files were stolen from the US National Security Agency NSA by a former CIA contractor, Edward Snowden, and exposed in the Guardian. And going to Scotland, the Herald headlines warning to doctors as threat superbug resurfaces. A warning that the hospital bug Clostridium difficile is threatening lives in Scots communities has been issued by an expert on infectious diseases. Doctors acknowledge the death rates caused by the bug are still at a 15% high. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. From today's top Middle East stories, we chose an analysis about the US rapprochement attempt to regain Saudi confidence. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia invests in training rebels to continue fighting in Syria. So let's start with this top story. Starting from England, where the Guardian headlines, "Is Syria crisis Saudi Arabia to spend millions to train new rebel force Riyadh fighting two wars in Syria as new force Jaish al-Islam excludes Al-Qaeda affiliates in bid to defeat Assad regime?" The English paper's Mideast editor Ian Black examines some facts related to this very controversial Saudi move against a member Arab state. Ian Black adds, Saudi Arabia is preparing to spend millions of dollars to arm and train thousands of Syrian fighters in a new national rebel force to help defeat President Bashar al-Assad and act as a counterweight to increasingly powerful jihadi organizations. The paper identifies forces involved in the Saudi plan, namely Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam created in late September by a union of 43 Syrian groups. It is being built as a significant new player on the fragmented rebel scene. The force excludes Al-Qaeda affiliates such as the Islamic State in Iraq and Al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, but embraces more non-jihadi Islamists and Salafi units. As per the report, Saudi intelligence chief Prince Bandar bin Sultan is pressing the US to drop its objections to supplying anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles to the JAI. Jordan is being urged to allow its territory to be used as a supply route into neighboring Syria. In return, diplomats say Riyadh is encouraging the Jaish al-Islam to accept the authority of the US and Western-backed Supreme Military Council led by Salim Idris and the Syrian opposition coalition. Mustafa Alani, an analyst for the Saudi-backed Gulf Research Center, says there are two wars in Syria, one against the Syrian regime and one against Al-Qaeda. Saudi Arabia is fighting both. The Jaish al-Islam or Islam Army is led by Zahran Aloush, a Salafi and formerly head of Liwa al-Islam, one of the most effective rebel fighting forces in the Damascus area. The paper adds Aloush recently held talks with Bandar bin Sultan along with Saudi businessmen who are financing individual rebel brigades under the JAI banner Other discrete coordinating meetings in Turkey have involved the Qatari Foreign Minister Khalid al-Atiyeh and the US envoy to Syria Robert Ford. Emil Hkayem of the International Institute for Strategic Studies observes the Saudis are saying that if you don't join the fight against al-Assad, you will end up with a much bigger jihadi problem. They are being a lot more proactive. That means taking the rebellion a lot more seriously and trying to develop as many proxies and allies as possible. The Guardian sees that the Saudi assertiveness has grown along with the unhappiness over US policy towards Syria and Iran. Saudi intelligence chief Turki al-Faisal described Obama's approach to Syria as lamentable. Yazid Sayegh of the Carnegie Foundation warns the Saudi leadership should be careful what it creates in Syria. Mohammed's army may eventually come home to Mecca. Another skeptic of the Saudi desperate plan, Thomas Pierret of Edinburgh University, sees that the effort also faces problems of capacity, coordinating and delivery. And he adds, the Saudis and Qataris lack the means to shape insurgent groups. They have a lot of money but very poor intelligence. And Pierret concludes the Saudis promises rebels more money if they unite, but some will end up getting more money than the others, and the coalition will break apart again. And from Riyadh, Daily Star's Angus McDowell writes on the Saudi-US rapprochement in his very interesting article. He observes recent diplomacy faux pas from the Saudi part and aspects that lead to the very proactive and somehow unilateral Saudi plan to invest in a wrecked rebel force in Syria. McDowell sees that if Secretary of State John Kerry visited Riyadh to reassure top Saudis that their anger over US Middle East policy is unfounded, he has more work to do. McDowell says King Abdullah, who is 90 this year and rarely meets visiting officials, mustered a full complement of senior princes to sit in on Monday's talks with Kerry. And he adds, Saudi leaders face fear President Barack Obama's administration has stopped listening to its Arab ally, particularly on Syria's civil war and the nuclear dispute with Iran. This risks handling regional supremacy to their chief rival, Tehran. Kerry offered assurances in Riyadh, saying Syrian President Bashar al-Assad must depart and that the Saudis would be kept fully abreast of nuclear talks with Iran. And despite recent rapprochement, Riyadh's message has been uncharacteristically blunt in public in recent weeks, and as Senior Prince Intelligence Chief Bandar bin Sultan spoke of a major shift away from the United States. The article suggests the Saudi leadership, which fears Obama does not share their belief that Iran is engaged in an attempt to gain dominance over the Arab world. And the Washington Times, let's have a look now at the Washington Times, where James Morrison writes an article headlined, Embassy Row to Saudis, Obama a paper tiger president. In this article, Morrison illustrates the elements that caused the recent drift apart in US-Saudi relations, highly visible in Saudi's almost unilateral step to invest in training rebels in Syria. The article starts with a bold, Syrian President Obama is losing respect in Saudi Arabia and risks US influence in the entire Middle East, where Russia is posed to pounce. Abdulaziz Sagar, director of the Gulf Research Center, argued that the visit to Saudi Arabia this week by Secretary of State John Kerry did nothing to diminish Saudi anger over a range of Obama's policies in the region. Sagar notes Obama's popularity in the Middle East has sunk as low as President George W. Bush's approval rating after the US invasion of Iraq. Obama is a paper tiger president, he says. Sagar looks at Obama's bending stances towards Syria and their effect on American foreign policy globally. He believes this has damaged his relations with Saudi Arabia, a foe of the Syrian regime, with his hesitation to act quickly and his later decision to allow Russia to take the diplomatic lead, he adds. What is at stake today is not only the future of the Syrian regime and the potential devastating consequences that a continued Syrian civil war has for the Middle East as a whole, but also the role of the US in a future Middle East. Understandably, Sagar concludes that with his decision to erase the red lines that it itself had announced, the US has affected its own moral standings and left huge question marks about its ability and willingness to uphold international order and enforce respect for international law. Very interesting and indeed a very bold analysis there from Mr. James Morrison at the Washington Times. Now let's have a look at our second story from the Middle East. Moving on to other elements in the Syrian conflict, let's have a look at what other analysts are saying. Writing from the Syria Times, Dr. Muhammad Abdul Ibrahim discusses in an article headlined Turkey's destructive role. According to Al-Ibrahim, Turkish authorities have recently seized a large quantity of chemicals which could be transformed into weapons. The whole of sulfur and another unidentified substance will be examined by a team of army specialists, a Turkish army statement said. Al-Ibrahimi states that accordingly, the main Turkish opposition Republican People's Party has raised questions over the seizure of the said chemical material, along with barrels of unidentified cargo in vehicles which attempted to illegally cross the border from the Turkish side to the Syrian side over the weekend. Al-Ibrahim says the Turkish Riyadh daily quoted CHP Deputy Chair Farouk Logoglu as saying that one person has been arrested. Barrels which are suspected to contain chemical material were inside the vehicles. Traffic was from Turkey to Syria. Do not be surprised if a statement suggesting that the arrested person is a Syrian spy comes from the government. Logoglu voiced a doubt that a case looking into allegations that radical terrorist groups in Syria were seeking to produce materials that could be used to produce highly toxic sarin gas was being covered up. Ibrahim goes on to say that the release of the primary suspect in the same case was criticized by CHP Deputy Horsid Gunes. Furthermore, Gunes says we want this case not to be closed. If the case in Adana is closed and these terrorist elements are acquitted, then it will be a shame for Turkey. Turkey cannot be a place where Al-Qaeda elements can be nurtured and can get rest. The indictment was based on the probe into chemicals seized in the southern province of Iskenderun late in May. To conclude, he claims that recently the Financial Times reported that Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists in Turkey to rest, recover and regroup before the next onslaught in Syria to wage jihad. Ibrahim adds that the four fighters from the Syrian city of Homs sit cross-legged on the floor of their cramped sleeping quarters. On the wall beside them are the flags of the Syrian opposition, Turkey and the black flag of jihad. And looking at the Geneva II Peace Conference, news website Al Monitor leads its news with an article written by Ambereen Zaman headlined Syrian Kurdish leader Turkey may end proxy war, featuring an interview with Saleh Muslim, the co-chairman of Syria's most powerful Kurdish party, the Democratic Union Party, PYD. Zaman says Saleh Muslim, the co-chairman of Syria's most powerful Kurdish party, the Democratic Union Party, PYD, had been holding talks in Geneva with Russian and Western officials in preparation for the planned Geneva II Peace Conference between the Syrian government and opposition groups. In the interview held in Paris on November the 7th, Zaman sought Muslims' views on what progress had been achieved and where his group stood on a solution to the two-year Syrian conflict. According to Zaman, Saleh Muslim, who said the Geneva II talks were unlikely to take place in the near future, he blamed the lack of progress on the Istanbul-based Syrian National Coalition and regional powers, Turkey and Saudi Arabia. But Muslim explains, all are demanding that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad step down as a precondition for any peace agreement. Saudi Arabia is opposed to Iran's participation. That position is expected to be reiterated when the SNC meets in Istanbul on November the 9th and the 10th. While Saleh Muslim argues that demanding Assad's resignation was unnecessary when it is patently clear that he will be shorn of all his powers in any transitional government. The Kurdish leader added, we are working on the basis of principles agreed during Geneva I, and our focus should be to build on these, not to throw unrealistic hurdles. Muslim also believes that any attempt to peace that excludes Iran cannot succeed either. Muslim once again denied long-running accusations that his group is allied with the Assad regime. According to the writer, the PYD's refusal to join the SNC has plagued its relations with Turkey. In addition to Turkish pressure, this is why the United States continues to shun contact with Muslim. Zaman sees that the Syrian Kurds, who represent around 10% of the country's population, ought to have a strong say regarding Syria's future. Saleh Muslim insists that the Kurds ought to represent themselves at the Geneva Conference, a position that is backed by Russia. Their demands for greater political and cultural autonomy must be enshrined in a new constitution, and these need to be negotiated with a future transitional government, not with the opposition, which, as Muslim put it, is a complete mess. And to conclude, Zaman states that Turkey's alleged proxy war against the PYD might be over. Yet, according to Muslim, there have been no jihadist fighters coming from Turkey as before. Turkey has ended its support for the jihadists. That is how things look now, and we very much hope this state of affairs will continue. The absence of Turkish involvement helped the YPG capture Til Halef, a long-coveted strategic hilltop village lying 4 kilometers west of Ras Al Ain on November the 4th. Writing for Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, Amir Tahiri article headlined with Kerry's model of preemptive surrender. Tahiri says the party that entertains the illusion of winning through negotiations is certain to emerge as loser. Tahiri states, offering a curtain raiser to planned talks on Syria, US Secretary of State John Kerry has offered an analysis that is sure to doom the enterprise from the start. The outcome of this will not be determined on the battlefield, but at the negotiations table, Kerry said. Tahiri said that while such a platitude might be useful for table talk, adopting it as the basis for policy making is scandalous. Had Kerry been familiar with history, he would have known that the outcomes of all wars are determined on the battlefield. The writer goes on to say politics in general and diplomacy in particular could be effective in preventing the breakdown of the status quo. Once the breakdown has happened, politics and diplomacy become weapons of war. And then Tahiri explains that as far as the protagonists are concerned, politics and diplomacy could be used to mobilize domestic support, find external allies, and split the adversary's camp. The writer claims that the outside powers interested in the outcome of a war could also use politics and diplomacy to garner support for the side they favor. The most important political decision to make is to choose the side one wishes to support. The power that chooses not to take sides becomes an objective ally of the party that happens to be on the ascendancy on the battlefield at any given time. Tahiri continues saying at the start of the Syrian conflict, President Barack Obama seemed to have understood these facts. But the writer points out that when he stated unequivocally that President Bashar al-Assad must go, he appeared to have chosen a side. Tahiri says that 3 years later, Kerry reflected the changing position of his boss, which has cancelled that choice. He now pretends that the US is pinning its hopes on a political solution. The writer indicates that what position in the US adopts is of special importance for 2 reasons. The first is the US is the only outside power that could help shorten a civil war by taking sides. And the second reason is that unless the US takes the lead, other countries capable of making a difference by supporting the anti-Assad rebellion will do nothing beyond diplomatic gesticulation. Tahiri believes that by refusing to take sides, the Obama administration gives the powers that supports Assad, notably Russia and the Islamic Republic in Tehran, an advantage by reducing the costs of their policy of repression in Syria. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. Starting with the Moscow Times, which headlines, Russian airlines yearn for new rules on electronic devices. And the New York Times, which headlines today, West and Iran seen as nearing nuclear deal. And the Times of India headlines, 14 patients saved but doctor killed in clinic fire. And finally, from France, Le Monde headlines, Prostitution, faut-il pénaliser les clients? In English, prostitution, should clients be penalized? That was all for today. Hope you've benefited from our selection from various papers analyzing top stories today. I'll be back with you Monday for another press review.